And we're going to look at Lesson 8, how to study Proverbs. How to study Proverbs. All right, so we got a little quote here by Thomas Watson. Sins against illumination and conviction make deep wounds in the soul. Other sins fetch blood. These are a stab in the heart. Every little hole in the roof lets in rain, but a crack in the foundation endangers the fall of the house. Every sin of weakness is prejudicial, but sins against illumination crack the conscience and threaten the ruin of the soul. To sin in this matter makes sin the heavier and hell the hotter. Woo. All right, a little teacher's tip here. We're going to break down another text so you can see its inspired structure and what talks about what. You don't have to do the diagram. You don't have to do this. You don't have to do, there's actually formal diagram. This is called a text flow diagram. You just want to make sure I do this so I can just visually see what is talking about what and kind of visually see the structure of the passage. It's super helpful, at least to me, because I'm more mechanical. I like to see it this way, but you don't have to do it this way. You don't have to do a diagram, but you do have to figure it out if you're going to be precise and accurate. What's talking about what has the primary emphasis, and what is talking about what's primary, or what modifies it is what it's called. So let's look at the 1 Timothy 1, 5 through 7, where Paul says, but, which contrasts, which comes right before it. So you'd want to look at the near preceding context and say, what did Paul just say in verse 4? And before that he is contrasting. Okay? But the goal of our instruction, this is the thing being talked about, the goal of our instruction. That is the subject, the thing being talked about. It exists in the state of, it's not an action verb, it's an existing verb, is, the goal of our instruction exists and is love. Now, these three phrases here tell us about the goal of our instruction, okay? Which is love. The goal of our instruction, which is love, or is love, from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. Okay? So here, these three phrases modify the goal of our instruction, which is love. 4 then tells us that he's now going to discuss in a little bit more detail what the goal of our instruction is, which is love from the pure heart, good conscience, and sincere faith. For some, straying from these things here that he just mentioned, that modify the goal of our instruction, which is love, have turned aside. So when you reject love from a pure heart, love from a good conscience, and love from a sincere faith, when you stray from these things, you then end up turning aside to something ugly, different, bad, evil, to fruitless discussion. You turn aside and you want to be teachers of the law, maybe, even though you don't understand either what you're saying or the matters about which you make confident assertions. So you might outline this, if you're going to teach this, the bullseye of biblical instruction. 1, shoot for love. Driven by a pure heart. It's driven by a good conscience. It's driven by a sincere faith. Love driven by these 3 things. That's what we're shooting for. Don't turn aside to other targets. Don't engage in fruitless discussion. Don't lust after being a teacher. Don't teach in ignorance. These 2 phrases talk about the person who doesn't even understand what they're saying. So notice how I got these phrases, these 2 main points, and these phrases just directly from the text. There you go, teacher's tip of how to submit to the inspired structure and grammar of the text. There you go. All right, moving on. Now we're going to talk about Proverbs. Proverbs are tidbits of wisdom from God to help us live wisely. If God's wisdom in the book of Proverbs is heeded, It will spare us from a life of sin and misery. Yet many people don't understand how to study Proverbs. Most know that the book of Proverbs teaches us wisdom, but they don't know how to go about studying Proverbs in an organized and systematic way. In this study, we will take some time to consider some of the characteristics of the book of Proverbs and how to study this unique portion of God's Word. Characteristics of Proverbs. Remember that Proverbs are wisdom statements, truths, or truisms. They are not magical formulas that produce absolute predictable outcomes. They are easy to remember statements that remind us of how to apply God's wisdom to our lives. They show us the way we should live. They often give us normal, but not guaranteed outcome of applying God's wisdom to our lives. So, for instance, Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Usually, if you do a good job training up your child in the way he should go, usually he will come to the Lord and follow the Lord. However, it's not guaranteed. Many faithful parents have diligently trained their children, and those children have still rejected the Lord and have departed from the way of the Lord. Proverbs 23:9, do not speak in the hearing of a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of your words. Now, though that's often how fools despise, it's not guaranteed that they will despise you. It just often happens. It's a truism. Warning, just because Proverbs are general axioms of truth, that does not mean we can ignore their teaching. So just because the results aren't guaranteed, we don't want to take Proverbs and say, well, we don't have to go by that wisdom. No, it's always best to take the advice of Proverbs, to apply the wisdom of God given in Proverbs. But remember, they are not formulas for instant predictable results. You want to make sure of that because you don't want to be mad at God or think God has lied or deceived you or the Bible isn't true because you've done what God said and you didn't get what you wanted. No, you do what God says regardless of the outcome, regardless of what you want. You do it because it's right. They are words of wisdom which should always be applied and which usually bring success. Remember to watch for parallelism. There are three major kinds of parallelism you can find in the book of Proverbs: synonymous, antithetical, and synthetic. There are more, and there's all kinds of words and stuff. I'm just going to give you these three because they're kind of big categories, and they'll help you with most of the proverb texts, and you'll be able to see how this works out. So let's talk about synonymous parallelism. It comes in two different types, either identical or similar. The key word to look for is and at the beginning of the second line. So identical parallelism states the same thing twice but uses different words. So Proverbs 14:13, even in laughter the heart may be in pain, and the end of joy may be grief. So notice how you have laughter, which parallels joy, and pain parallels grief in that proverb, and there's the and there. Though they don't say the exact same thing, they're very similar or identical. When you have this and there, you often see similar or identical. In this case, they're pretty much laughter and joy and pain and grief they're really close, identical for the most part. Proverbs 16:16, how much better it is to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding is to be chosen among silver. So here you have pretty much identical parallelism. You have wisdom and understanding, and you have gold and silver. Yes, different words are used, and yes, different metals, but pretty much the same thing is being said twice, but in just slightly different ways. Then you have similar parallelism, which is a little bit different. You're going to see now the first and second line are not as exact. Proverbs 16:20, he who gives attention to the word shall find good, and blessed is he who trusts in the Lord. So notice here you have give attention to the word, find good, so you have good, and then you have the person who is blessed, which is kind of like finding good. And instead of listening to the word, you're trusting in the Lord, which is similar, but it's not as exact. Do you see that? Proverbs 17:27, he who restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. So notice that you're restraining your words, okay? You have knowledge. And then cool spirit, it's not identical to restraining your words, but very close. And then knowledge and understanding, they're close. One is like accumulation of data. The other is the meaning of that data. So close, but not identical. Similar, but not identical. Then you have what is called antithetical parallelism. That is, where the first line contrasts the last line. You'll see lots of this in Proverbs. Usually something good is contrasted with something bad. The key word to look for is but at the beginning of the second line. So, for the lips of an adulteress drip honey, and smoother than oil is her speech, but. So now you see the contrast here. But in the end, she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps lay hold of Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways are unstable, and she does not know it. So notice, though she may be good-looking, though may she, have sweet kisses, and she may speak with a soothing voice like oil. In contrast, she leads men to hell. Okay? That is the strong but. It's telling you she may appear this way and offer these pleasures, but bad things are coming afterwards. Proverbs 12:18, there is one who speaks rashly like the thrusts of a sword, but in contrast, the tongue of the wise brings healing. So you can wound people with your tongue or you can heal people there. They are antithetical. They are opposites. So when you're studying Proverbs, you want to look for that but word in the middle that contrasts the two so you can say, okay, I get it. Here's synthetic parallelism is accumulative or climactic. It builds in repetition the same truth. Each line builds upon the same subject matter, expanding the previous line a little more. Proverbs 19:17, he who is gracious to the poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deeds. So notice, it's talking about a gracious person lending to the poor, and that person is really lending to the Lord, and then it adds more to it, and he, the Lord, will repay him, the gracious man who lends to the poor, for his good deed. So it's accumulative. It's not antithetical. It's not similar. It's not identical. It's just this is true, and this is more about what is true. Accumulates more information. Proverbs 27, verse 15 and 16, a constant dripping on a day of steady rain and a contentious woman are alike. He who would restrain her restrains the wind and grasps oil in his right hand. So notice you have the constant dripping in this day of steady rains, talking about this woman, and a contentious woman are pretty much alike. Just nagging, contention, discontent, whatever. And then it tells us more about this contentious woman. He who would restrain her restrains the wind. And then it tells us more about the contentious woman. And it's like grasping oil with your right hand when you try to restrain her. So there you have it. That is kind of what would be some synthetic. It kind of accumulates, stacks line upon line to give you more intel. So if you just have those three in mind when you're studying a proverb, it will help you say, okay, what are we talking about here? Identical things, antithetical things, similar things, accumulative things, and that will help you teach the proverb or series of proverbs, if they're related, in a more exact way. Remember to watch for groups of proverbs that have similar theme or address the same truth. For instance, all of Proverbs 7 has a unified theme. It's all about Solomon speaking to his son and tells a story about the naive man, the adulterous woman, and then gives warning. So there's kind of pre-warning, there's post-warning, and the story in the middle. It's like the whole chapter. You see the same thing in Proverbs chapter 31, verses 10 through 31. It has a unified theme, about the excellent wife. So there's a couple sections where multiple verses talk about the same thing. There's not a lot of sections like that. Sometimes you can find Proverbs which have like a chapter which has multiple proverbs on certain themes, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in just a minute. Remember that to God, knowledge doesn't become wisdom unless it is applied knowledge. Wisdom is the art of right living, not the knowledge of knowing about right living. Did you get that? Wisdom is the art, the actual application of right living, not merely knowing what you should do but don't. There are many exhortations in Proverbs to walk, obey, listen so as to obey, do not, heed, etc., which emphasize the application of wisdom. Wisdom actually is lived out. So knowledge is the data, understanding is the meaning of the data, and then wisdom is the application of the meaning of the data. So you can know things but not understand them. You can know and understand things but not have wisdom because you don't obey them. So if you want to be biblically wise, you have to know the facts, understand their meaning, and how they apply to life. That makes you a wise person. Proverbs 1:15, my son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your feet from their path. Notice the exhortation, not merely that there's dangers, but to do something about it. Proverbs 19, verse 20, listen to my counsel, accept my discipline, that you may be wise the rest of your days. Notice that you may actually live according to the wisdom that's being given. So I'm just going to stop here for a second. I'm going to shoot over and kind of look at something real quick with you, which we've looked at before and we'll get to in a second, but I want to kind of cue it up. We're going to look at, we'll just look at Proverbs. I'm just going to pick 20 in the middle of the book. And do you see this right here? All of these here? If you remember, we had talked about this before. One of the ways you can study Proverbs, I think we talked about this, is you can create little labels. Now I do this in Logos, but I've done this in paper Bibles. At the beginning of the book of Proverbs, I kind of have A for adultery, and A/S for anger and strife, and bad company, BC, and business, and counseling, and death, and finances, and giving. And when you read Proverbs, like it's just this chapter 20 in the middle, I have L for leadership, anger and strife, work, counseling, parenting, business. Do you see that? Work, business, finance, business, counseling, bad company, and speech, parenting, business and finances. Notice how I've labeled these. This is one of the ways, as you're just reading a chapter of Proverbs a day or whatever, you can label them. And it's really helpful because it creates a little index. And when you look through the book of Proverbs, you can just say, oh, this one's about this, or I can find all the business ones, all the giving ones, all the key counseling verses or whatever. And it just helps. So I would encourage you to do something like this if this looks like something you'd like to do. And over the course of time, you can fill up your paper Bible, or if you have a digital one like this with all these little things. Logos allows you to make custom annotations like this. So that's one of the things I do. Now back to our lesson. Studying Proverbs. So now we're going to study Proverbs. We talked about the different kinds of Proverbs and how they kind of appear, and groups of similar Proverbs or related Proverbs or antithetical or similar or cumulative or synthetic. Okay. Studying Proverbs. You can study individual Proverbs. Proverbs 17:12. A rebuke goes deeper into one who has understanding than 100 blows into a fool. That is very picturesque. It is very clear. And the meaning is pretty obvious, right? But you could go into that. You could develop the doctrine. You could talk about, what it means to receive correction and people who don't, and why it's foolish, and on and on. Proverbs 29, verse 1, a man who hardens his neck after much reproof will suddenly be broken beyond remedy. So there you have somebody who is hard-hearted. He's not listening. He won't accept reproof. And we are told that oftentimes that person is broken beyond remedy. God just swats him down and it's over. So you can teach on those individually. That would be fine. Another thing you can do if you want to teach Proverbs, You can study a series of connected proverbs that have a unified theme. So remember, like Proverbs 7 or 31, those are big ones, big unified themes. But notice some of these other ones. Like apples and gold as settings of silver is a word spoken in a right circumstance. Like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear. Like the cold of snow in the time of harvest is a faithful messenger to those who send him, for he refreshes the soul of his masters. Like clouds and wind without rain is a man who boasts of his gifts falsely. By forbearance a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue breaks the bone. Now you might take this whole section here and teach on this because there's a lot of related themes. You would then want to combine the intel and this section that relates to one thing, and that would be like a main outline point, and you'd go through the section and point out all the occurrences and teach on that. And then you go to another thing that's mentioned and all the places it appears, and you could put an outline together that way. Here's another example, Proverbs 27, verses 13 through 16. The sluggard says, "There's a lion in the road, a lion in the open square. As the door turns in its hinges, so does the sluggard in his bed. The sluggard buries his hand deep in the dish and is weary of bringing it to his mouth again. The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can give a discreet answer." So notice, this is all about the sluggard, right? It's unified. It's all talking about different things about the sluggard. So you create your outline about the different things this portion teaches you about the sluggard, and then you can teach on that. Another thing you can do if you want to teach Proverbs is to study a collection of Proverbs which speak to the same theme. Proverbs 12:1, "Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid." Proverbs 13:18, "Poverty and shame will come to him who neglects discipline, but he who regards reproof will be honored." Proverbs 15:32, "He who neglects discipline despises himself, but he who listens to reproof acquires understanding." Proverbs 19:20, "Listen to counsel and accept discipline that you may be wise the rest of your days." So notice how all of these Proverbs speak of kind of the same thing. Are you going to receive counsel and be blessed, or reject it and not be blessed? So you might take these and other ones like them to kind of create a sermon or Bible study title. And then you use these as key cross-references to build upon the doctrine or God's wisdom in these areas. And this is positive, this is negative, examples, key cross-references. You can do that. So you can study collections of Proverbs. You can study verse by verse through Proverbs, even if each proverb teaches a different truth. So notice that each of the Proverbs below address a different truth, but all of them have identical structure. First, an obvious parallel truth is stated as an illustration, then a more obscure and not so obvious truth, which the author is trying to communicate, is stated. So, Proverbs 27:18, "He who tends a fig tree will eat its fruit, and he who cares for his master will be honored." So notice you care for your fruit tree, you get positive results, you care for your master, you're honored. They're not identical, they're kind of similar, but it's kind of an interesting proverb, isn't it? And it teaches us things that we can then teach. Here's another one, Proverbs 27, verse 19. Notice all these verses are in a row, they're all one after another. And though they're talking about different things, they all have similar structure. So they're a united group of Proverbs on different themes with similar structure. Proverbs 27:19, "As in water face reflects face, so the heart of a man reflects man." Proverbs 27, verse 20, Sheol and Abaddon are never satisfied, nor are the eyes of man ever satisfied. Proverbs 27, verse 21, "The crucible is for silver, and the furnace for gold, and each is tested by the praise accorded him." Proverbs 27, verse 22, "Though you pound a fool with mortar and pestle along with crushed grain, yet his foolishness will not depart from him." So you might let's say, do a 5-sermon series or 5 Bible study series or 5 Sunday school lesson series, taking each of these proverbs one after another, verse by verse, one after another. Since they talk about different things, it'd be best to take them kind of one at a time because they're pretty radically different, aren't they? But they all have the same structure, so you could say, we're going to look at this section and have those different lessons to impart God's wisdom to people. Okay, so how do we interpret Proverbs? Many Proverbs are clear in their meaning and application. It just jumps right off the page. We know exactly what we need to do. Now, there are other instances where it might not be clear what exactly the proverb is teaching. Below is an example of a proverb that some have used as a proof text to say that borrowing is sin. Notice how the principles from this lesson, as well as the other principles already learned, are used to examine what this particular proverb means and how it applies. That should be fixed there. The text is Proverbs 22:7. The rich rules the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. Okay, so now we're going to take our Bible study, principles, our hermeneutical principles. We're going to do exegesis, and we're going to try and find out exactly what this text is and is not saying. So we have some preliminary observations. Proverbs 22:7 may seem to tell us that borrowing is wrong. We can first observe that there is an "and" at the beginning of the second line. By looking at the contents of the parable, we can conclude that it is synonymous parallelism. Both lines saying something similar to each other. Not identical, but very similar. This means the first line teaches something similar to the second line. You see how helpful that is? Just to establish that is super helpful, as we shall see. By examining the first line, we learn that rich people rule over poor people as a general truth. Is that true? Yeah, it's always been true. By examining the second line, we learn that, in a similar way, since it is synonymous parallelism, borrowers become slaves to lenders. If you wanted to rearrange the second line so that it matches the first line in order, you might say that lenders, the rich who have money, become masters over those who borrow from them, the poor, in that the debtor must repay the debt. They don't become a slave in every way, but they become responsible or obligated. We call this an obligation, not really a debt. A debt is when you fail to meet your obligation. An obligation is fine, but having debt is not. You don't want to owe somebody or not fulfill your obligation. Notice also the word pictures slave and master. One who borrows does not literally become a literal slave, neither does a lender become a literal master over the borrower. The borrower is bound to repay the debt, and in that way he is enslaved, figuratively speaking, to the lender. The lender is similarly like a master in that he has a right to expect repayment of the debt from the borrower according to the contract, the obligation that has been established between the two. So here's some word studies. I have these double spaces in here because I did this a while back. Word studies. The word rules is a Hebrew verb which can be understood to describe something which has occurred in the past or something which is still continuing or progressing from the past but hasn't been completed, or it can describe a future condition which might happen. Here, the continuing progression of what is true but which is not completed is probably in mind. The word might be paraphrased in this first line as the rich have been and continue to be ruling over the poor. The borrower is an active participle which expresses continual action. It might be paraphrased in the second line as the one who is continually in the process of borrowing. The lender is a causative active participle. This might be paraphrased, the one who is continually in the process of causing himself to lend. If we were to write an amplified, paraphrased translation, we might write it in these words. In the same way that rich people have been in the past and will be in the future ruling over the poor, so the one who habitually borrows from the one who continually causes himself to lend will be in a continual state of obligation to repay his indebtedness. Notice how word studies make the meaning of the text clearer. More observations lead to better and more accurate interpretation. Notice the lender is voluntarily and continually lending, causing himself to keep on lending to the borrower. Notice that the borrower being spoken of here is one who has a continual pattern of borrowing. He keeps borrowing. It's not talking about one time, we're talking about a guy who keeps borrowing all the time. Since both lines are similar, we need to ask ourselves, is it evil that rich rule the poor? And the answer is no. There is nothing wrong with rich people ruling poor people. The proverb never says that borrowing is evil or sinful or that it should be avoided. If it was, you would also have to say it is morally wrong to be ruled over by the rich, since borrowing is paralleled with being ruled over. The proverb is not saying that by borrowing you become a literal slave any more than having someone rule over you makes you poor. The borrower is like a slave in the one respect he's obligated to pay back his debt to the lender. He is not free to be delinquent, but is bound, figuratively speaking, like a slave, and that he must pay back to the lender, meet his obligation, who in this one respect has a right to expect repayment, like a master who expects obedience from his slave. It is saying that by borrowing, you become indebted to the lender, but only in the matter of having to pay back the debt. You must be his servant in the sense of working to repay what you owe, meet your obligation. It is saying that those who voluntarily lend money to others have a right to expect repayment according to the contract. Timeless truths or wisdom to apply from this proverb. Realize that the rich will usually rule over the poor because money can be a form of power. Secondly, realize that if you are one who borrows from another, you will be obligated to pay your debt to the lender, and he has a right to expect you to do so. 3, realize that if you continually borrow, you will be under continual obligation to repay. And finally, realize that if you lend to someone, you have a right to expect repayment according to the contract. There you go. Those are some principles about borrowing and lending, but it's not saying that all borrowing is sin, as some have wrongly stated. Homework. Without looking at any commentaries, using only your sharpened hermeneutical skills from this lesson and previous lessons, seek to observe, interpret, and give practical applications of the 3 proverbs listed below. So now you're going to just try and, by looking at it, not any commentary, don't look down at the footnotes in your study Bible, just look at the proverb itself and try and note it, what kind of proverb it is, identical, antithetical, similar, cumulative. Try and find out what it is and try and just answer the questions and see if you can work at kind of getting a little bit better interpreting Proverbs. Proverbs 6:28. Or can a man walk on hot coals and his feet not be scorched? Now notice or. something comes before it, but I didn't put that in there. You're going to have to figure that out. Helpful observations of what the text does and doesn't say. Remember the king of all Bible study principles. Near context. Interpretation of what the author meant by what he wrote. Put it down what you think it is. Application ideas for how this proverb might apply to every Christian's life. How to put the meaning into practice. Proverbs 15:8. The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination of the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is his delight. Helpful observations of what the text does and doesn't say. Interpretation of what the author meant by what he wrote. Application ideas for how this Proverbs might apply to life. Proverbs 30, verse 15 and 16. The leech has 2 daughters. Give and give. There are 3 things that will not be satisfied, 4 that will not say enough. Sheol and the barren womb. The earth that is never satisfied with water, and a fire that never says enough. Okay, so you're going to take these 2 little proverbs here, Proverbs 30, 15, and 16. Helpful observations of what the text does and doesn't say. Interpretation of what the author meant by what he wrote. Application ideas for how this Proverbs might apply to life. That's your homework. That's your homework. And we're almost done with the series. We've got one more lesson to go after this. I hope you will do your homework and hope to see you in the next lesson.
DrivenNails.com is a user-supported ministry.